my presentation here is turning DataFlows into LookML with DBT. Big thanks for the Utah Data Engineering Meetup for hosting me today. I really appreciate it. It's been great to have the support of Joe and the community. My name is Tyler Pugliese, and I'm a manager of BI for business systems at Fastly. Great. So tonight, here's a little script, a little preview about what's going to be on our docket. I'm going to explain Fastly, or at least try to. We're going to generate a speaker. We're going to check out some data wizardry. We're going to knit DBT just verbally. We're going to truncate some tables in Domo. We're going to check out Fastly Looker. We're going to talk about this migration that we have going on here at Fastly, and then I'll run some learns that we have at the end of it. Our theme tonight is kind of a code-based one, since I won't actually be demonstrating that much code, and live demos are always kind of tricky, especially when your internet isn't going well. So this is what we got. Okay, so Fastly. What is a Fastly? It's not an adverb, it's a proper noun, but we describe ourselves as an edge cloud platform which processes, serves, and secures applications as close to users as possible at the edge of the network, and more. If you're familiar with content delivery, some of our competitors include Akamai or CloudFront. We believe we stand out among those as one of the best out there, and we've got lots of products. What products, you might ask? We have a ton. There's a lot, and if you're in BI or in data analysis, you can see this list and you're kind of like, wow, not only are there a bunch of products now, I bet some of those have a historical legacy that get noted and categorized in their own wonderfully unique way. On the right, we've got some metrics that are from our marketing and our website. So we have about 100 terabits per second of network capacity, about 13 seconds of a mean global deploy time for code configurations, and we serve about 19 trillion monthly requests. So a request is any question for a piece of content on the internet. It's part of our bread and butter, how we measure traffic, how we have code configurations. But I want to focus in on that 100 terabits per second of network capacity, because that's kind of nebulous. 100 terabits per second. Are we being pulled over for speeding? What does that even mean? And I'm going to go into it. So we mean that in terms of capacity. If you're an edge cloud platform, how many requests or content you can serve depends on the size of the response that you are giving to the requester. And it's kind of the biggest limiting factor that we have as a platform. How much content can we produce or distribute at one time on our platform? So over here, you see this really nice sliding upwards graph of starting from less than 1 to all the way now 100 over a timeline. And that's all well and good, but what does that really mean? And one thing I've learned at Fastly is that it's really nice to be able to quantify some of these measurements. So I'm going to talk about a terabit is actually 1,000 gigabits. And gigabits might sound familiar, but if you're thinking about hard drives, you might actually be thinking about gigabytes. So there's 8 bits in a byte, and on your hard drive, you might have some number about what gigabytes are. What takes up a lot of byte size on a hard drive is actually video capacity. So a 2-hour movie is about 1.5 gigabytes. For reference, I found this from How Big Is a Gig website, which was really useful in trying to figure this out, because for 1 terabit, we can actually handle about 83.3 2-hour movies, right? If you think about that being a calculation. So we have 100 of those. So that is about 8,330 movies per second. But that doesn't really quite capture it either. If only there was some larger metric that was more uniform that we could all think about in terms of movies, right? Well, it turns out that there are about 3,781 movies on Netflix. So the next time you're looking at Netflix and you can't find a movie to watch, just remember that's a large data set. And to give that as a context, that means that Fastly can sort of push out about 2.2 Netflix movie libraries a second. Could push out. So that's a little bit more impressive than 100 terabits, but we're probably not allowed to talk in that way, but I can convert to it. So where does that all go? We have about 72 data centers around the world, helpfully located in large metropolitan data areas that people go to, where there are lots of people congregate. Congregations of people like to look at data. These are where our point of presences are normally had. We have about 72 distributed around the world. Here are some of our customers. You might recognize some of these names. These are the logos that I can officially use, so take a look. You might recognize some of these. You might use them daily. You might know them. They're great. I think it really shows the strength of what we offer as a company to show Vimeo, New York Times, New Relic, and Yelp, all different uses for our platform, all very happy with our services, all really great customers that use Fastly in very different ways. So we're going to generate a speaker. That's me. We'll talk a little bit about myself. I like to drop knowledge, not tables. I recently converted to leading commas, and you can talk to me after the show about why I'm wrong. I dislike @heres just in general as flat out in Slack. I once accidentally created 25,000 empty Google Sheets rather than one Google Sheet of 25,000 rows. Not that common of a mistake, but I did it. And if you're looking for me on DBT Slack, I'm at tpug, which is close to my handle at work. That's me on the right. Big fan of DBT, Jupyter, Domo, and Looker. I've spoken at other DBT meetups and Domo Palooza for the past 2 years. Really big fan of that, but that's sort of why I'm here. Our BI team, this is what it looks like now. I joined Fastly in 2012, not doing BI. I was a statistician, but now I work under the business systems team, which handles a lot of our enterprise software, including how BI interacts with them. Rajan Patel, my manager, joined us last year, and he's a senior manager. He will actually be speaking at the Modern Data Stack conference tomorrow at 11. Check him out. And last but not least, Spencer. He joined us very recently, but is already making a great impact in our data stack because of his knowledge of DBT and willingness to write large amounts of SQL in one session. All right, so our mission at Fastly for our BI team is we're trying to empower our business with trusted data and analytics on time to make informed decisions. Kind of clean, kind of cookie cutter. It's what's expected, but sometimes it's just nice to reiterate what the mission can be. I've worked at Fastly for a long time, and it's nice to just be able to have a mission or a goal set for what our team is trying to accomplish. And this is something that I always go back to when I'm creating data sets. Because our BI journey at Fastly has been really long and not necessarily tumultuous, but it's been challenging. I've worked at Fastly for a long time and pretty much have been managing BI for most of it, even when it wasn't really BI, even when during the first 4 years it was more just ad hoc SQL, everything being done in Excel. What's outlined here in the maroon are what I consider successes at the time. What's in red, there's kind of the failures of those states, and I'm sure people can relate, having been part of a data stack that's changed over time. So the first 4 years are really that we have systems, we have spreadsheets, put everything into a spreadsheet, munch it together, try and make it work. If you're building something, it kind of can take as long as 1 month. When it's at 1 month, it's already kind of stale. Moving to the past 2 years where we had Domo, we implemented Domo as our baseline platform. And it was really great to be able to take all those different data sources that we had, whether it was in Excel, whether it was in Salesforce or in BigQuery, join it together to have one cohesive data platform. But the data flows and the logic were kind of segmented by team, and it was hard to find where was my single source of truth for a source object if it came from Salesforce, BigQuery, or a spreadsheet. And sometimes when we relied on Domo, if something was not in Domo, it wasn't obvious where is that going to be found. Should we build that in Domo? How does it look like? Who has access to it? Who maintains it? There are a lot of questions that arise when everything is in one system and not everyone has the same amount of access. So this year, we've really revolutionized those underlying systems. So rather than extracting directly from BigQuery or Salesforce, we extract from Fivetran pushed tables to our BigQuery data warehouse that we use, rather than just uploading from the system. And we can add new sources via that methodology, rather than just doing ad hoc, what do we need at one time? Does it actually come from a Salesforce report? Is it the underlying object? Is it the correct underlying object? We really were able to clean that up, as well as really defining what our pipeline looks like with controls and user management. But unfortunately, some of our business logic still exists in those data flows, and it's really hard to extract that into a way that's meaningful. We also have difficulty maintaining groups across systems or even acquisitions. We recently acquired a company and now have to think about how to bring all of those people into our framework, right? So in the future, though, next year and for the next N years, we're hoping to manage our extractions from Fivetran. We're hoping to transform with dbt or SQL files. We're hoping that Looker reads data rather than re-uploading the entire data set. And we're hoping that the GCP and BigQuery facilitates connection. What we don't quite have right now is a defined dimensional modeling for our entire stack. That's a lot of work and a lot of words, a lot of communications between the team. We're still trying to figure that out. And because our team is only 3 people for a company of our size, we only have a limited time to generate and facilitate every business request. The nice thing, though, is that with our new framework, once we build something, it's generally there for a long time. It might not change drastically in the future when it's built in our new methodology, but we also have a lot of content that's in our old stuff. So we're going to check out some data wizardry. And just, I'm sure this comes up often, but this is something I really wanted to think about in talking about these times is, has everyone here ever created a piece of business logic that made you proud? You ever made something and you were like, wow, this is really cool, right? And generally that's why I tend to stay in this job and in this space, is because it really affords you the opportunity to make cool stuff that you're proud of. So me too. I've done that stuff. As I mentioned, 25,000 Google Sheets is not my most proud moment, but it definitely taught me a lot. However, when you make something that you're proud of, it's generally not perfect the first time. And if it's not perfect the first time, you generally worked on it many iterations about it. And it might not have been properly appreciated by a peer, whether they recognize how hard you worked on it or the new level of transformation that it brings or just the general impact on the business. And it might not have had the desired impact even if it was appreciated by someone and it was a good, strong piece of code. It might not have been used. I think this is a common struggle in the space as well. Just as it's easy to make something you're proud of, it's easy to make something that feels like it doesn't go anywhere. And one lesson that we've really learned from upgrading our data stack is that when you're making things in a new framework that you're happy with, that your team agrees with and is in line with your vision, it's much less likely that that won't be useful at some point when you're building a data set on the end of an already established data platform. So when I think about a new project that I'm taking on, such as a larger migration, I think about what is it supposed to look like? How can I imagine what I want that data set to look like, or that process, or that framework? Because I've worked a long time in the space and it's easy to start from a place of like, okay, what should my end state be? And from there, the ideation is sort of the part that gets you to that first link from what you have to where you want to end up in that minimum viable product. Once it finally works through all the steps, that's sort of the ideation part. And once it gets there, you need the iteration to build it out, to build a lattice, to make sure the framework holds up across your organization. Also, I found recently that things that I'm proud of, when I'm making things that I want to.
Tyler, I think your internet cut out for a second.
When you're building something that you're proud of, your identity kind of gets wrapped up into it. And just to talk a little bit more about that, business intelligence can often have very defined correct output in the eyes of our peers, requesters, or boss. There's often a championed correct process to achieve the results, structure, or logic. And at Fastly, and as we've grown through this process, I've had to reevaluate that status of correctness as our company has matured, as our team has grown, and as our systems have upgraded, and maybe even when I'm wrong or make a mistake. So it can be a scary challenging when these changes force you to confront parts of yourself that feel correct, but also you're personally responsible for because you want to feel proud of that. So when I take on a project to migrate our data stack, I have to ask my inner data wizard to help me level up. And it's too dangerous to go alone. And what I found is that I've really been able to lean into SQL and have SQL be the tool that helps me not only transform data, but help transform perspectives on larger projects that can be really overwhelming, especially when you're trying to migrate an entire data stack for a company. So SQL, we've always really used it to manage our data structures and our method of extraction of data to answer people's questions. But more and more, now that we're using something like dbt, we're using less logic that comes from DataFlows. We're using less ad hoc beast modes on top of the end of it, and rather baking that into the core of when we answer those questions. And when we build something in SQL, even though it's difficult and obtuse and explicit and sometimes gives you the wrong answer, it actually builds a piece of code that you can use. It's a lot easier to use a piece of code at a time to answer a question in the future when you've already built that, rather than trying to go back to something like a data flow and figure out, why did I make this? What is this used for? How can this help me? And SQL has basically made me a better analyst and self-governed project manager. So now that we have SQL, it's super, super easy. We just alter our Fastly modern data stack, and we're going to transfer everything from Fastly BI. That's not actually an acceptable SQL command, and if it was, it's probably something that we shouldn't do. That's how you end up with like 25,000 Google Sheets without any content in them. So what I mean by that is we have to think a lot more constructively about how we're building our data pipeline. So this is a really useful graphic that we have internally. It's cleaned up a little bit just so we don't go crazy detailed about things, but you can see basically we got our data sources on our left. We extract and load them into FragTran. We use our data warehouse in BigQuery to handle not only the raw data, but the transform data that we get from dbt through the Google Cloud VM. So whether it's a Google Sheet, another BigQuery table from another project, Salesforce object, a NetSuite record, or a Zendesk ticket, FiveTran is able to extract it. We put it into our raw data. We use dbt to read that raw data. We transform it into our transform data project. And then that project feeds into Domo, Data Studio, Google Sheets, and Looker. So if you can see here, we have outlined in red that we're planning to decommission Domo, mostly because it as a BI tool isn't facilitating the same requirements that we have as an organization to be able to manage our data sources, to manage those extracts by a system that's meant to do that, to be able to handle the transformations in a way that when we build excess transformations, they're not wasted. They're pretty clear about what they do. And in the future, we're going to be using Looker because it's version controlled, and we've been relying really heavily on that to be able to track changes to our code base. When we're overhauling our entire data stack, it really helps to be able to have a paper trail of documentation to look to be able to point in and say, hey, this is where we made that change when and why, and here's the JIRA ticket that it responds to. So to zoom in on that a little bit, the future state that we're looking for is something like this, where we have FiveTran on the left, we have the data loaders with our raw data. dbt is able to have version control, alerting, and logging. It snapshots, transforms, tests, deploys, and documents those changes and those transforms. It sits on top or in between sort of Google BigQuery, and it creates transformed data that we can use in Looker. And if you can see here, this isn't one system doing all the work. It's multiple systems working together. It's multiple different projects coming together with their own sort of nuances, which is more to manage for a small team, but it also really segments and separates the responsibilities when you're trying to be that more organized stack or that more mature data team. So this is something that we're looking to.
Hey, Tyler, you cut out for a second.
dbt and like talking about dbt, so I'm going to talk a little bit about dbt. It stands for data build tool, just much easier to say dbt. But what's impressive about it? Well, it can run our entire BI workflow in 90 seconds. As someone who works for a company named Fastly, that's pretty cool. Just to point that out there, we're still growing our configurations and all that, but just to have that flexibility of running that is really great. I don't know how long it would take Domo to run our entire BI stack, but it'd probably take more than 90 seconds. It supports version control through Git. I talked about how that's becoming a more important responsibility for our data team to be able to handle. It's developer focused and flexible for your organization. So it can handle the business structures and data structures that you have on your side, and it can make sure that they're documented in the same way that they would be when you're making it. It elevates SQL, your BI, and your organization. It's forced me to write a lot better SQL, and I'm really happier for that. There's a lot of templating you can do in that too, which I might be able to get to. Python, it's based on Python. It's open source software, which manifests itself as version SQL, YAML, and markup files. So it's this really great blend of SQL code, YAML being able to describe the more intricate parts of it, and markup files to be able to handle those more ad hoc or professional readmes or documents that you might have. Okay, you're convinced. What do you need to make DBT work? You need a DBT project. You get that, it's open source. You init that on your computer and make it work. You need to have knowledge of SQL and Git, you need some underlying data sources, and a space to host transformed data. And that might seem simple and it's easy to make it work. It's really difficult to make it do your entire data analytics stack, but that's what it's also designed to do, and up level in that way with your team. Okay, so just to come back to this, our BI mission is to empower our business with trusted data and analytics on time to make informed decisions. DBT just helps us do this really well. It empowers our business with more SQL transforms. We trust the data that comes out of it because we can see a historical legacy of how it got there. It's very speedy and easy to make changes, and it helps our end users make more informed decisions because they know what the logic goes into it looks like. Okay, so just a little brief segue about DBT. What happens when you type DBT run? It connects to your data warehouse. It parses your DBT project. It wraps your models based on the materialization, which we'll talk about later, and it creates those models. It executes that SQL to build those models in your target schema. If you have multiple models, it uses
Okay, well, Tyler, sorry, you cut out again.
between models.
Hey, Tyler, do you mind rewinding about 30 seconds?
Sure.
You froze for a bit. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. I again apologize. Internet is a difficult, tricky thing. When you run DBT, it connects your data warehouse via a profile and a connection. It parses your DBT project and wraps your models based on the materialization that you configure. There's different materializations for different processes that I'll go over later. And it executes the SQL to build models in your target schema, which can be wherever you want to host that data. For us, it looks like BigQuery. We target the schema, whether it's a development or a team-specific schema, and we write those models to that. If you have multiple models, it uses the ref function to create dependencies. Those dependencies work between models to create a lineage of logic that says, hey, I need my staging models to run before my fact models. I need my dimension models to run before my MART models. It also compiles the table into the name of what you label it, so it uses the correct schema for your environment. It also creates DBT docs will generate this really nice graph for you to use to be able to show people. And I know Domo has a data lineage, but we find this to be a lot simpler because there's not that logic within there. DBT also uses the stag to understand what order you want them in, and you can use it to split up longer queries. So just for an example like this, you might have a payment for Stripe that you have. It's different whether it's in your dev target or your analytics target, and DBT manages these environments. These slides were taken from DBT Learn, which I'll have a link to later. Really great training session that DBT can provide for your organization to give your team a good up-leveling. And this is what a basic DAG looks like. Again, this is a little bit easier to read than the data lineage. And when you're in here, you can select what models, you can tag these things, but it's really nice to show how your logic flows from one side to another. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how Domo translates to DBT as we're working, and how, now that we've gone over DBT a little bit, how we break up Domo or classify it. So the building blocks of Domo from our point of view, you have input data sets, you have magic ETLs, you have SQL ETLs, and you have these output data sets. Those output data sets can then become inputs for other data sets, other logic, and your cards and dashboards. So this is a snapshot of what it looks like in Fastly. How are those things different in Domo versus DBT? Well, your input data sets are extractions from source systems. They require credentials in the system and they're their starting point. In DBT, it's very similar. They're also extractions that require credentials and they're your starting point. The outputs in Domo, they're the result of a data flow. They require permissions and they can be an input set for other data flows. In DBT, they're the result of a DBT SQL model file. They don't require any additional permissions beyond what you have. And they can also be input table via the ref function for other DBT models. So data is handled very similarly in the two systems as long as the source systems are in a structured environment that you can use. Staging data sets are extracted as source models that can combine the input data sets of select columns, filtering, or sort of that idea when you build a magic ETL, you have your input, and then you might have a select columns, you might have a filter object after that. And if you're familiar with that, you can easily see the difference between that and what's on the right here, where we have just a simple source file that says, hey, for my Salesforce account, I want my ID, I want to rename it as my account ID, I want my name, I want the vertical, maybe a sub-vertical, who's the owner, and just give me the ones that aren't deleted. Select that from rename, and I have a Salesforce accounts table that when DBT runs, it might generate if I wanted to. Where they really differ is in the amount of logic that you need to accomplish something. So if you're familiar with Domo, you're probably already aware that if you're trying to do something higher level within your Domo data flow, it can be really difficult to get that logic in a way that makes sense. So for our company, we end up working a lot with dates and with time. And on the left here, I have a Domo data flow that's basically trying to get the first, fifth, and sixth day of this month. And this was for a billing project where they needed those actual dates depending on whatever day it was. Well, in Domo, I need to tell it, hey, my date has a month and a year. Then I need to add constants of 1, 5, and 6. Then I need to concatenate those together to get the first day of the month, the fifth day of the month, the sixth day of the month. Then I need to say like, hey, those are dates, right? Create dates out of them from those different inputs that I have. And I need to select the column type and say like, hey, those are actually dates. I have dates. With SQL or with DBT, it's very simple to use those date functions to make something that's a lot more usable. So I might have just a date field. I might have an entire conformed date dimension that I'm pulling things from. But this is a lot easier to read and a lot more manageable than something like magic ETLs can be for very specific yet agnostic logic. And this might be a little bit of an unfair comparison because you could also build that in Domo to have that underlying data set that has the first, fifth, and sixth. But it's just obviously much easier and much more readable to know what's going on the right side versus the left side.
As somebody who's worked in Domo a lot, I totally agree. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yep. Okay, so we talked about magic ETLs. If you have SQL ETLs or data fusion, they're basically already staging models or CTE references. You're doing the same work that you might be doing in DBT to be able to have that, where your transform represents factor dimensions, creating a desired output that turns into a mart.
Tyler on silent again.
Is that it
Hey,
wouldn't
Tyler,
tell you.
Sorry, can you
Sure.
rewind about 30 seconds again? Because you just froze. So.
No problem. Let me get the
Cool.
chat up here.
Yeah, it was basically on the SQL ETL slide. We started it. So many froze. Yep.
Great. If you're using SQL ETL, your input data sets are basically your reference functions. Your transforms are those CTEs that you might have to create that logic, and it's already very SQLized. You're not necessarily using Domo any more than you would be using SQL. You're just doing that in the framework. Similarly, beast modes, most of the time they're case or some form of end result transformations, are also SQL. Most of them you can already fold into your data logic. And what's nice about having this in DBT is that you actually have SQL validation. You're working with something that's natively SQL. And more importantly, too, your transformations can be placed anywhere, not just at the end, and you can take them with you, unlike beast modes. Okay, so I talked a little bit about materializations, and I just want to really leverage and speak to another really cool thing about DBT is that you can define how you want your logic to show up in your data target, in your target schema. So you might want to have views that are the default form, which are used to validate, test your business logic. No data is stored, and it's very similar to running a preview in a data flow. You can create tables, which are the expected, which are the expected form of the output. They're used to solidify your logic, your data, your joins. You're actually writing data to the system, and this is similar to the default of creating an output data set in Domo. What's really cool is making ephemeral models. So these are in-memory transformations for intermediate logic. You can build building blocks which don't require viewing, and it keeps your logic in warehouses clean, and you don't need to write or create other SQL files. I don't know if you've ever been in the situation where you're creating a Domo data flow, you build sort of this intermediate output, and you're like, oh, that's really great before I have to filter it down for this one report or add this other join. I just want to be able to use that. What's really nice in DBT is taking that model, making it its own sort of file, and using that for other purposes without ever writing that actual file or data set to a database anywhere. And lastly, you can have incremental models that apply the logic only to new records. And this can be optimized for event-based data. It's more advanced, and it's similar to snapshots, or if you're familiar with Domo, this can be like recursive data flows, but it's just nice to have this in the same configuration that you might need for either your views, tables, or ephemeral models. So in our migration plan, our goals for our Domo demolition is to get a single source of truth for highly functional data sets. One of the biggest problems we have are imports from Salesforce get re-imported in different ways with slightly nuance, and it's really hard to tell which one people should use for their analysis. We want to communicate that also while doing this, we're not going to build a one-to-one replica of our Domo instance. When we're building down and we're breaking up what we had and turning this into the new platform, we're not going to rebuild every single data set or every single data flow or every single card. We're really focused on streamlining it down into what matters and what people use, which means we also get the challenge of redefine existing KPIs, metrics, and processes rather than just recreating everything, which has been really nice and empowering to have with stakeholder groups, especially when we learn about something that we might not have known was so required for their business. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what our goals for Looker are. So what makes Looker different is that it's a data visualization platform focused on programmatic structure of source data without having to cache everything. And over time, your logic becomes centered in key files meant to provide consistent formatting, framing, and structure of data across an instance. So rather than trying to relabel every single instance of this metric you might have, you can define it once in the source file and have those important facets of that data, documentation, a reference file, a formatting applied in the same place for your entire instance. Just to go back here, what also makes Looker really great is that we're really invested in the Google Cloud Platform, and Google just bought Looker. We're really invested in having version control manage our SQL and our instance and our change management, and Looker really promotes that with the connection with Git. So not only does it make sense for how when we're reconfiguring our platform, it aligns with the new principles we've had that we've invested in our team. We're also really looking forward to a hub and spoke model. And what this means is basically we're going to have a hub of data, and each team gets to show up and take whatever spoke or data sets that we think that they might need or that they request and turn them into something that they can use. So a hub is similar to a replica of our data warehouse. We have everything basically that we might need. And again, we don't need to worry that much about cost because it's the same data. Looker isn't trying to cache that or create a local copy of it. We can manage the updates in Git. The BI team submits pull requests. We can instantly read updates when we run DBT, and we can have the single source of truth that we can give to people, and we can clearly say, hey, this is what Salesforce accounts should look like. versus a spoke where a team might need a specific subset of those accounts. They might only want accounts that have an account manager or a specific sales rep from a territory. We can also manage the updates in Git for the spoke, which is really nice, similar to how we have that in the hub. Stakeholders can submit pull requests. We can submit pull requests on behalf of stakeholders when we have a change, and they receive updates from the hub, which also means that they receive updates from DBT, which is really nice. And they can control their single source of metric logic, as I mentioned earlier, where they can define how that KPI gets formed, where is that source data, how are they documenting it, how is it calculated, and they get to control that rather than us having to guesstimate or be lagging behind their new changes. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our migration and the plan that we have. I apologize if there's more hungerness for showing code or looking at that, but again, live demos and just what I'm allowed to show from our organization. So when I started this plan and I thought about how are we going to do this, right? How are we going to take an entire data visualization platform and turn it into another one? It's not necessarily like an Indiana Jones bait and switch, right? Because not only do data visualization platforms not work that way, but our entire framework relies around us taking all that logic out of Domo, turning that into SQL, having that SQL represent that underlying business logic, and then push that business logic into Looker in a way that makes sense. So breaking it up into 4 swim lanes, we got our building blocks, right? Where we got to define and engage our stakeholder groups. So for example, we might have sales, marketing, and the BI team themselves. We're going to, in phase 2, audit, annotate, document, and design that BI future state. We're really going to think about, to imagine, to ideate, and build something that we're proud of. So we're not just going to go from Domo to Looker, we're going from Domo through DBT to Looker. We also have to refactor our data flow logic into DBT models using Kimball methodology. So every data flow doesn't just exist as a end result output data set and a ETL file. We really want to think about these into fact, dimension, and marts. And if you're not familiar with Kimball methodology, I have a link to the data warehouse toolkit in the end. I highly recommend it if you're getting into some more advanced modeling for a company that has very specific and detailed data requirements. But finally, again, sort of mimicking our BI future state from the start, we want to scale up Looker with the business logic data in the entire Fastly company. So it's not just enough to have our data in Looker. We're going to have this advanced hub and spoke model that matches how we actually want to distribute our data and validate a source of truth. We're going to have user groups that are defined based on the stakeholder groups that we start with. And we're going to have to onboard new people to those groups and figure out what they mean. But most importantly, throughout this all, we have a migration goal of we need all demo content reviewed, tagged, refactored, retired, and ready to extricate by June of next year, which is, all right. So how did we get there? Similarly, in the beginning, a lot of openness and a lot of communication. So I started with saying an attainable goal for each of those different swim lanes. So for the first one, we need to be able to define our timeline expectations to those groups. We need to be able to talk with them and have a measurement of success. For the second one, we need to be able to design the logic, process, and flow. It's not enough to just design a future state, right? We have to design how are we going to get there? How are we going to incorporate new logic? How are we going to refactor our existing logic to make that work? What's our flow going to be like? How are we going to manage Git? How are we going to review submitted pull requests? Things like that. And once we're in number 3, we're actually going to do that dimensional modeling of systems, which I labeled as an attainable goal and feels really large right now, but it's definitely a thing that we're interested in doing because it makes it so much easier to combine fact dimensions and mart tables together in a way that makes sense for our organization. And finally, there's stakeholder groups. We want to retain them from our first swim lane and turn them into groups that we have trust with, communication, and actually become our meeting groups for the future. And throughout that all, we have this focus on messaging. So to start with, we have to talk about why our current state doesn't work. And talks like this and meetings with our stakeholder groups are part of that communication to be able to talk about how what we currently have doesn't fit our needs and we need to ideate on this process or this SQL file or this logic that we're really proud of to elevate it for the next generation of Fastly business intelligence. I think another thing here that I pointed out is crutches. And those to me mean like when it's an established corner cutting, right? That you're like, we should probably be doing that a little bit better, maybe doing that a bit more proper. And that's one thing that I think we've really established on our team now with trying to figure out version control and reviewing each other's work. Because for so long it was just me running around making tons of Google Sheets. And now to actually be held accountable, that is really good for not running around and creating thousands of Google Sheets. So our next set, our focus for our messaging is going to be the future state strengths, concessions, and structure. So where is it going to be really strong? Where are we going to decide to limit ourselves to what our vision entails and what the structure is going to look like? So this is really the payoff from the second swim lane of what is our future state? What is it going to look like? Where are we going? And how are we going to get there with recognizing that we're not going to build a one-to-one Domo replica in Looker, right? We're going to have to change some things. People are going to have to figure out how they handle their KPIs, where those things are documented. And structure as well to be able to say, this is where that's documented. This is how we're taking that responsibility on. And finally, I have here risks and obstacles to think about. So to start with, it's pretty small, right? How do we measure success? How does each group measure success? How do we communicate that? That can be different for each group, and it could mean different levels of work for our team. But then it gets a little bit bigger about how do we restructure our data? We're going to have to design a future state where everything is different than it is right now. And sometimes in BI that can be really scary because most of what we do is just to show the current state of logic. But we also need to show the current state of logic, work on models, and answer requests at the same time. We're a small team, and it's been really stressful to try and do that, which gets in the way of this entire migration. And finally, from that, how does our team transition from an ad hoc report facilitators into a champion of version control, refined business logic, and the SOX compliant single source of truth? And that's a really hard obstacle to answer without doing things like making fact and dimension tables, without having a hub and spoke model that controls user input, where that data comes from, who those user groups are, how they have access, and how do new users access those things. And to get back into that structure, where do those metrics come from? How can people trust them, right? Because one thing that we have to figure out as a BI team is how do we have new things enter the system, and how are they managed and incorporated? And all of this, again, of the migration goal of having all Domo content reviewed and extricated by June 2021. So that was a lot of talk. That was a lot of words about what we're currently doing. Appreciate people sticking with and listening with that. Our future vision of BI is using dimensional modeling in DBT with BigQuery and Looker as a basis. And throughout it, what I want to champion about that is being able to define what your modeling looks like in so many ways is really helpful from a DBT perspective. It really helps facilitate all that modeling that we want, structure that in a way that's cohesive, concise, and version controlled, and does it in a way that I'm proud to work on and I'm happy to work on. And Spencer kicks butt, Alan. We also want to make sure that the data pipeline is clear, clean, and documented. And this is probably a goal that my boss has a lot that's really hard during this ideation, that it's not enough to just create a really great instance of your new data and your workflow. You also have to make sure the old stuff gets purged. You have to make sure that you migrate off, that your ideation process and your imagination gets handled in a way that makes sense and doesn't clutter up all the other logic that you're working on. Because at the end of this, if we just have 5 models per business process, we're just kind of replicating the same mistakes we made with Domo and those data flows, which is now a place where we want to be. Eventually in the future, we want to use Jinja templating for advanced DBT modeling. It was kind of felt like beyond the scope of this talk, but there are some really, really cool things you can do with DBT macros, with Jinja Pythonic programming in your data flows to really elevate them beyond the restrictions of a single system. And it's really awesome to be able to add that templating into an already powerful performant language like SQL. And our end goal is one BI platform and one source of truth. Currently, we're not there, but that's the future vision of BI that we're working on getting to. And I wish everyone luck in getting there, because Sort of to get back to that Excel model, once you build it, it feels like it's just that way for like maybe a month, and then it's already out of date. It's already out of sync by some process. And I just want to eloquently talk about some takeaways that people might have. So I'd recommend that find what makes you proud when you're working in the data space, even if it's imperfect or unrecognized. Just be willing to change and update and make it modern. Make sure you communicate with your stakeholder groups and do so proactively. You don't want any surprises when you're doing a migration like this, and you want to make sure people feel included and heard and recognized, especially when it comes to their data. Teams can get very defensive about where that line of ownership is, and the more times you communicate to your stakeholder groups, the better off you'll be down the road. I also recommend that once you have that vision and you have that future state, share it with your coworkers. Figure out where it matches their ideas and where it doesn't. Figure out where you can combine strengths and where you need to still talk about blind spots that you both might have when you're building that vision, because it's a lot easier for a team to lead people to that vision than for 3 different people trying to lead different groups. And with that, trust your vision on larger projects. Even though it may feel difficult that you don't have the one SQL file that matches exactly to get there, it's important that you use that trust or that vision or that mission statement that you have to always help you out if you get lost or if you aren't sure about incorporating a feature or a data set. And finally, this one honestly is mostly for me. Just don't be afraid to migrate, even if it means rebuilding the whole damn thing. And with that, I have some really valuable resources. DBT's community is really great. The community Slack is really awesome. Sign up for Learn DBT if you're really interested. If you're looking for what is a more advanced company use DBT for, I recommend the GitLab handbook that they have for their data team, where everything that they do, all changes are added and they're talked about and they're reviewed there and they're updated. Obviously, DBT's documentation is great. I highly recommend their documentation, but they also have this really great how to structure DBT project. So if you're figuring out how do I actually structure this, what is it supposed to look like, then you're not quite at the GitLab data team. It really helps to give you a framework to build that makes sense for your organization. And finally, can't do a talk without giving a shout out to Ralph Kimball's data warehouse book. It's over 2 decades old at this point, but still really great. I highly recommend it. And that's my talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyler. Applause for Tyler. Because in the case statement.
I appreciate everyone sticking through when my internet was not the most stellar.
No, it's fine. I think everyone got the gist of it. Yeah, you did a really good job. Audience questions. Comments?
So you said you have the data centers, like 72 different data centers. Are they like physical data centers or cloud points of presence?
They are physical data centers. There are racks. We have a whole network engineering team. I would be impressed if we had 100 terabits of capacity in the cloud. That would be super impressive. But no, we have physical data centers. We have the ethos of trying to make them smaller and more robust in performance with SSDs than we do having a wide, many different ones in many different locations. And we tend to group them around metropolitan areas and airports.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, so I have a few questions here. I guess, how do you reconcile sort of the boundaries between like LookML, transformations you could do in LookML, say, and DBT? What's the delineation with your team?
That's a really good question. From my point of view, anything that's an aggregate should be done. Any sort of grouping and measurements and sort of how you would think of rolling up things should be done in Looker, and you should have the most granular table possible coming from DBT or from your data source or your data warehouse. And then anything you make in Looker that you approve as sort of a categorical item or classification, we don't want to stop people from developing in that way. But then once it's there, you can then take that data and push it down into DBT. So anything that's quantitative, we recommend measurements or things like that, especially if they're grouping in large amounts or on a time basis, to have that in Looker in your LookML. And anything that's qualitative that you think other teams might use, that should be part of the underlying data set, that's a case or a classification that you might have, similar to how beast modes are handled in Domo, right? Push those down into the underlying models that you have, because you might be surprised about where that model might actually show up that people might not have access to in Looker.
There was a question in chat. You want to ask that? Pani?
Yeah. Do you use enterprise version of DBT or do you use the open source version?
We currently use the open source version, and we actually use the CLI version of it. We really like writing in locally on GitHub, but considering how our data is becoming more important to have regularly updated, we might move to something like the cloud scheduler to be able to handle that rather than how we currently do it, because it's important to have redundancy in that way. And as you're breaking out models, being able to define how different models run at different times based upon when the source data gets updated is really powerful, especially with those referential functions.
Early in your talk, you talked about a soapbox of openness. Do you want to elaborate on that? I'm very curious about that soapbox of openness, especially with respect to stakeholders of your BI initiatives.
Yeah, I find that I personally am a lot more successful when I've been forced to have more open communication with stakeholders, and just as someone who works in data all the time, I found that there's a lot of success about trying to connect with what those stakeholders need with what you're able to provide them, and being able to communicate in openness about what you're trying to do has been really helpful in not just professional life, but in my personal life. And just the fact that sometimes data can feel very impersonal, or when someone is trying to find out how is the data wrong. Is it something from the underlying system? Is it something that you've done? Is it something like that? It's important to try and work with stakeholders on the same side and get them to trust you. And my boss says that trust is doing the same thing over and over again. And part of that is communicating open and honestly with stakeholders. And I wanted to feel comfortable, or at least uncomfortable, doing that here in the talk, because I think it's an important part of stakeholder management, of conveying expectations, and of trying to communicate with your teammates about what's your vision, what are you trying to do, where do you need help.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and to couple, I guess, that question into something else you're going through, and I think in your last slides, I mean, it seems like as you move to more of a code-oriented BI platform with the DBT and LookML and SQL and everything else, I mean, what has the transition been like in terms of developing more of a data ops, DevOps type culture at Fastly?
It's been really frustrating, to be honest, because I'm coming from, I used to be able to do, however I wanted to develop something, and it would get done. And as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of different ways to do almost anything in SQL, but having to come to consensus and align with teammates about that can be really empowering when it is in terms of empowerment and safety, right? Like when I'm trying to make something and I know that there's a process to do things, it makes me feel like I'm part of a more mature team. And I think it helps us in the organization where we're at be more respected as a team, because our engineering team, we have our own in-house structure and method of code review in our own sort of Shipley environment, right? Or Travis CI, where we have our own method of doing that. And when our data team is aligning to those same principles, it really helps us feel like we're developing something more than just someone's ad hoc report for their Monday morning meeting or for their Q2 analysis. We're building that culture because, frankly, it does a really good job of handling the up-leveling and maturity required for bringing data analytics to, or data engineering to, a mature company.
It makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
But it's been very frustrating for me personally. It's been a challenge, but in a good way.
I'm sure people in this audience can attest to that. So yeah, it always seems like the people issues are they're a different animal than the data issues for sure. So yeah.
And I think for me, it's just been really, like I said earlier, tough on it's really easy to get wrapped up in identity around these things and about like what data means to people. And especially when you're facilitating requests, and a big part of why I work in the data space is to be able to ease people's difficulty in answering their own questions. And when I think about that and align myself to that a lot, it can be really tough to have to switch entirely about how you answer people's questions in so many different ways so quickly that it makes me feel kind of like I can't answer people's questions, or how do I trust doing that at the same time? And that's, again, trying to lean back on some of that framework we have about version control and accountability and communication with your team. And I think as we've been growing as a team, it's been forcing me to grow a lot more into a better teammate, which has been tough.
So how do you handle the situation where there might be maybe, I don't know if you have to deal with this, but maybe competing definitions, you know, for what data can possibly mean?
One thing that we're trying to do right now is to get stakeholders to think about what does an update to their change looks like, because typically those competing definitions or questions or KPIs don't come from a historical point of view. Typically, if they're that way, they're different ways of looking at something. So a really good example for us is recognizing bookings versus revenue. So when someone orders something and pays for a product, that might show up differently in revenue than how they're actually paid. But trying to talk to those two teams and figure out, like, okay, do you want bookings or do you want revenue? And trying to figure out the differences between them and define them is difficult, obviously. One thing that we really try and do is, again, that's like where the stakeholder meetings come in, and try and facilitate with them to get them to have some input about what a bookings data mart looks like, what does a revenue data mart look like, and trying to help show them through the new framework and use that as a method for a little bit of humility and just be like, oh, well, we don't know. We're trying to do this new thing. Why don't you help us redefine it, right? Why don't you help put your thumbprint into the code base and show us how should we be calculating this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to go about it, because these sorts of soft skill things, it's a team sport, right? So you could take the approach of having the monolithic data team try and define everything for people, but then everyone has their own opinion about nearly everything. And there's always competing interests in businesses too. So it's cool you're getting a handle of that right now versus kind of letting the business, letting time take its course. So
it's been nice to have the historical view about it, because it really makes me able to speak to the deeper meaning behind why things are done a certain way. But then it also makes it so that I know why things are done that way, and it's hard to be as agreeable to changing them or updating them, because I have that kind of like, oh, well, these are how things are done, right? Like, this is, let me explain it to you. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that everything that we're doing right now is kind of in flux, and that's okay. And that's another reason, again, that we're trying to lean on this like DevOps culture and communication.
That's cool. Well, I hope it works. It should be a fascinating journey, and so it's like anyone who does DevOps. Who in this audience has undergone like a DevOps or DataOps journey? Just out of curiosity, would you be willing to maybe talk about it for a second? Nobody? Okay, I know a lot of the people here. I know you're probably lying, so, or just want to be quiet. It's fine. I totally get it. So, any other questions for Tyler? Cool. All right, Tyler, it's been real. Really appreciate you presenting and sharing your journey with us. I think it's awesome the progress you've made, and it'll be really cool to see. We should probably do maybe a regroup maybe in a year or something like that and see where you are. So, pretty cool.
Yeah, I would be really appreciative of that, just as I'm appreciative of your time and the community for accepting me and letting me talk about this journey that I'm on.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tyler. Thanks to Fastly for everything, and thanks to everyone who showed up. Matt White, great presentation. Yeah, it was a great presentation. So I can leave it open for networking for a bit if you guys are down for that, or we can just close it out. Either way. So show if you want to do a reaction with a thumbs up. Who would want to do more networking for maybe 10-15 minutes? I'll take that as let's close it out then. So, all right. Well, okay. So we'll end it now. Then we'll see you guys back at least at the next UDEM. So that'll be posted very shortly. So anyway, thanks everyone. Have a good one. See ya.